Okay, today we're looking at the context to Storm on the Island. You are going to be making notes in your book as we go through, and then at the end of this short video, your teacher will ask you to close your books and will quiz you on what you've just heard. So, Storm on the Island. Now, the first thing to note when you're reading the poem is that Stormont, which is the name for the Irish Parliament, is hidden in the title of the poem. You can have some discussions as to whether the context of the poem is essential or if it just adds an extra dimension. But what we do know is that Seamus Heaney, the poet, was someone who was deeply interested in Irish politics and the relationship between Ireland and the United Kingdom. He grew up, for example, in Northern Ireland. But he has commented himself on the fact that his childhood and his family in many ways represents the conflict within Northern Ireland. His father was a farmer, for example, and had been farming the land for generations. His mother was from sort of the industrialised Ulster region, and so he, in some ways, represents this union between North and South, and also Catholicism and Protestantism, which we'll come to in a moment. Now, before we get into modern Irish politics, the first thing to note is that the history of Northern Ireland is fractured. You don't need to have a complete history of this, and you won't need to reference very much of this in your exam. But the key bullet points are that the conflict in Northern Ireland, or in Ireland in general, goes back generations. And you can trace it probably further than this, but at least back to 1169 and the Norman invasion. And the key point is that throughout history, Irish territory has been unstable. Constantly threatened or ruled by predominantly English kings. And that obviously breeds an awful lot of resentment. So for many people, England and Ireland have always been natural enemies, if you like. That's been more or less true across time. But we really start getting into modern Irish politics when we get to 1798, which might seem like a very long time ago, but actually the scars from the 1798 rebellion, which was an incredibly violent and brutal response from England to the rebellion are still felt today and still sort of fascinate people today. Partly because not only is it seen as emblematic, so, an important, recognisable moment of the clash between Imperial Britain, Imperial England, and the people of Ireland, but it's also the moment where Irish independence, by which we mean political autonomy, and by autonomy we mean the right for the Irish people to rule themselves, was under threat. As a result of this rebellion, England stamped down hard on Irish politics, and from this point onwards, for a century, Ireland was largely ruled from England. which, as you might know from history lessons or from other English lessons, this coincides with the height of the British Empire. But then we get to 1919, and you might also see the significance of this date, which is that we've obviously got the end of the First World War, and potentially a United Kingdom that is no longer sort of fit or strong enough to fight off rebellions. And so in 1919, you see a rebellion from the IRA, which we'll come back to. It is the Irish Republican Army. Against British forces fighting for the British Crown. And for the first time, some success. So, a bloody conflict, and it ultimately leads to, in 1921, a sort of uneasy stalemate in the creation of Northern Ireland. This is true to this day, so you may know this already, but from 1921 onwards, you have this uneasy compromise, if you like. You have the Republic of Ireland, which is independent, and from at the moment, for example, is part of the EU, where we're not. That is majority Catholic. And you have Northern Ireland, which is a relatively small part of the country geographically, but has quite a large population. And historically, it is pro, I'll put English, but we mean the United Kingdom. So pro-English, majority Protestant. And since then, we've had a relationship full of conflict, where you have two different populations sharing a nation with very different political lines, and who feel maybe that there's a huge cultural difference because of religion as well as politics. So from the creation of Northern Ireland onwards, we have perhaps an uneasy relationship between the North and South. We have what we might describe as simmering tension, where they're coexisting, but generally, people of the Republic believe that Ireland should be united and ruled from Dublin, and people in the North believe the opposite, that actually it should be united, but ruled as part of the United Kingdom. This comes to a head not just in the 1970s, because what we're looking at here is a period called the Troubles, which you might think as lasting sort of more from maybe even the late 50s up until the 90s. But Bloody Sunday is the thing that really sticks in the memory. There's a small picture of it here, but all you need to know about it is that it represents perhaps a turning point in the relationship between Britain and Ireland. And Bloody Sunday itself was again, just like the 1798 rebellion, a violent response to a political uprising, where the British Army fired on a crowd of protesters, many of whom were unarmed, innocent civilians. This is one part of it. But if you were to ask someone in England or in the United Kingdom about this era and how they felt, the other side of it is that the IRA throughout this era was seen as a terrorist organisation and was responsible for a number of bombings on the UK mainland, including quite a famous one where they attempted to assassinate Margaret Thatcher at a political conference. The point is that throughout this time, both sides drew blood, and it was a period of immense rising tension. So it was never an easy relationship, but in this era, the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a general atmosphere of fear and discontent. And then finally, getting to the better news, we have 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement, where Tony Blair manages to broker a peace deal by inviting IRA members and broadly people who stand for the Republic to have a say finally in a plan for a united Ireland. Some measures were put in place, and by and large, 1998 marks a new period of relative ease. That is not to say that there are not still tensions in Ireland to this day, but we haven't seen terrorism or a sort of a return to the sort of conflict that we saw in the 1970s and 80s since. If we ask why all of this matters, well, Seamus Heaney grew up in Northern Ireland and experienced many of these events firsthand. And much of his work is doing two things. One, trying to trace through the causes and the effects of this conflict, and a lot of it is calling for sense and decency and perhaps a more united Ireland moving forward.